So again, we welcome everyone to today's Consumer Energy Alliance Tele-Townhall. We're very happy that you're here with us. We appreciate your support. Our speakers that you can see on your screen right now are John Eichberger, the Executive Director of the Fuels Institute, as well as David Holt, President of the Consumer Energy Alliance. And the two of them will be leading an open discussion on the impact of transportation-related environmental initiatives on energy consumers. Now, we're going to break down today's discussion in three different segments. It will focus on these three. First, carbon pricing. Second, biofuels. And finally, the electrification of transportation, and especially what you're seeing happen globally with a lot of the ICE or internal combustion engine bans. So at the end of each overview, what we plan to do is John will allow the slides to stop and allow us to look at the questions that you present. If you notice in your chat box, you can present questions to us in the attendee chat. We will be monitoring that throughout. And then once we get to each break in between each section, we will address those as well as anything that David may want to bring up in the conversation. And we look forward again to your interactiveness with this conversation. So with that stated, again, we welcome you, and I will turn this over to David.
Donovan, thank you so much, and welcome to all the CEA members who were able to call in today. Happy New Year to you. This is our first Tele-Town Hall of 2021. Hope everyone had a safe and relaxing holiday, and we're already off to a crazy year in 2021. We're very happy to have John Eichberger here with us today. As many of you may know, John is a member of the CEA Board of Directors. We've had a long collaboration with the Fuels Institute and with John over the years, and he's provided a lot of influence and direction as CEA has grown over the years. So we're really, really grateful for John. We're also enthusiastic that CEA was able to be one of the sponsors of this study that the Fuels Institute put together. Some really good work went into this, and I think it's real illustrative of what CEA's core mission in 2021 and beyond is, which is representing families and small businesses and making sure that energy and fuel pricing, or energy and fuels, are affordable, reliable, and provide continued environmental progress. So I think this study helps illustrate all those three components without making a specific recommendation. It really just presents all the facts out there so regulators, policymakers, and individuals can make their own informed decisions. So I'll be jumping in and out, helping to maybe answer little questions, but I think John has so much to present here. It's best that we turn the floor over to him. And as Donovan mentioned, please use your chat function for any questions. I'll probably provide or ask some other questions as we move forward, but happy you guys are here, and very happy, John, that you're able to join us. So the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, David. Appreciate it. I'm going to get my screen shared here, then we'll get cracking. As David said, John Eichberger with Fuels Institute. I'm happy to be a part of the CEA Board of Directors. Been a great experience in the work that CEA is doing to educate stakeholders and policymakers about the fundamentals of energy are critical. As David said, we embarked on this study looking at the various environmental initiatives that affect the transportation sector with a goal of providing a comparative analysis of objective assessments so that we know what options are available to reduce emissions from the transport sector. We know what their cost might be, and we know what trade-offs are available. So today I want to talk about initiatives to reduce carbon from transportation. Donovan already told you the three major buckets we want to discuss. Real quick about the Fuels Institute. We were founded in February 2013, so we turn 8 years old next week. I've got a young kid, so basically we got our second graders now. Started talking full sentences, complete sentences, and this study is definitely an example of us doing that. The slide you see now is our board of advisors. We have created, I believe, one of the most diverse organizations in the sector, from automakers to refiners, biofuel producers, retailers, technical advisors, engineers, you name it. We're trying to get the biggest and broadest perspective on these issues we possibly can, and I've circled Consumer Energy Alliance is on our board of directors as well. It's a great reciprocal relationship we've had since we were founded 8 years ago. And it's something we really look forward to. We were very pleased to partner with CEA in getting this research project off the ground. So this is a study. The title is An Impact of Transportation-Related Environmental Initiatives. We officially released it in October. We're doing a massive push this year to make sure that the content and the analysis are viewed and heard by the target stakeholder community. As I mentioned, it's an objective comparative analysis focused on effectiveness and cost. Now, at the end of the presentation, I'll show you the landing page. The report itself is about 45 pages long. But so much work went into this. The comprehensive slide deck, which is available online for you to look at, and there's an index to help you guide yourself through it, 170 slides long with 4 or 5 data points on almost every single slide. So what you're going to see is I've combed through that closely to try to pull out the salient data that I think is most relevant to the topics at hand. We started off looking at 37 movements across the globe, initiatives to create that menu of options that are being considered to policymakers. And then we narrowed it down to 14 that we did our in-depth analysis on. And this slide here shows you the comparative relationship between them. Each one of these is placed as it relates to the others. The higher up on the chart, the more effective the initiative is in terms of reducing emissions, improving efficiency, or transitioning to zero-emission vehicle market. The further to the right, the more costly it is. The larger the circle, the more regionally diverse it is. The smallest circle, maybe a localized congestion mitigation program. The larger the circle, a national rollout project. So you see how they relate to one another. Telecommuting, moderate effectiveness, low cost. ZEV mandate, high effectiveness, high cost. So as Donovan said, we're going to look at 3 specifically. We're going to talk about carbon pricing first. Then we'll go to biofuels, electrification, and ICE bans. And I'm doing this because I think we know ICE, we know electrification is happening. Biofuels are there because we need to reduce the carbon intensity in the liquid fuels as we transition to a lower carbon transportation sector. And carbon pricing has been identified by some energy companies as the preferred choice because it's transparent and it's clear. There's no hidden mechanisms in it. It's very, very easy to understand. And we're going to start there. It is gaining momentum. This originally was put into place with a couple other initiatives. I pulled out carbon pricing specifically. And the effect of carbon pricing, this is going to be very important, it's the last slide of the section, is really proportional to the rate of the fee being imposed on the market. And when I say it's gaining momentum, it's because it really is, globally, completely. The map on the left shows you all the markets in which a carbon pricing mechanism has been implemented. The chart on the right shows you the growth in just the last 10 years. In 2010, only less than 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions were covered by a carbon tax or some sort of fee. 2020, that went up to 20%, with Asia Pacific being the fastest growing market. Now, if you look back to 2005, Europe was really the only area in the globe that was doing carbon pricing. So we're going to spend a lot of time looking at what Europe has done. They definitely have the longest experience. Started in 1990. I believe Poland was the first one to implement some sort of carbon fee. But the range of fees being imposed in Europe is staggeringly broad. From Poland at 8 cents per ton of CO2 emitted, all the way up to Sweden at $132 per ton. Now, if you average them all out, it's about $40 a ton. And so when you start looking at some of the analysis, a lot of people use $40 as the metric, the benchmark, to evaluate should the carbon taxing, what would the impact of a carbon fee look like on a market? And that's exactly what our researchers did. If you look at a $40 carbon tax, the impact on the energy sector is broad. From the Fuels Institute perspective, we're focused pretty much primarily on transportation. From CEA's perspective, you're looking at everything. And a carbon tax falls disproportionately heavily on the coal industry. It can actually increase coal prices by about 264%, according to some studies. On the natural gas sector, again, a major impact, 50% increase in the price of natural gas. On the gasoline market, it is still a significant impact of 40 cents per gallon, but by comparison to the others, it's fairly modest. And we look at what happens in the market with 40 cents per gallon in a couple of minutes, you'll understand what I mean by it's a fairly modest impact. Now, there are several proposals in Congress recently to impose some sort of carbon fee. And one of the things I want to point out is the range of proposals. A lot of them start in the $20 to $40 range. There's one, the Larson White House bill started in the $50 range. But the rate of increase, some of them stay flatline for the period of the next 10 years. The Coons bill jumped up to $160 per ton by 2030. Now, if you take us back to this slide here, where $40 equates to 40 cents a gallon, $160 is going to equate to about $1.60 a gallon in fees for gasoline. The impact on coal and natural gas would be so much higher. The other thing here is you have to understand, how are these revenues being generated and how are they being used? The idea is you pose a carbon tax and you raise the rate of carbon intense fuels and energy sources, and you inspire the marketability and the viability of alternatives with lower carbon intense thresholds, or you encourage conservation and reduce consumption. But at the same time, I'll show you a slide in a minute that kind of betrays that approach. You're generating a lot of revenue. What are you doing with it? 42% of the global revenues collected in 2018 from carbon fees were reinvested in some sort of environmental project. Now, I'm not talking about it much today, but the Transportation Climate Initiative, being considered by the 12 states in the northeast corner of the United States, they're looking at reinvesting the vast majority of revenues from their carbon fee into transit, ZEV, pedestrian, those type of programs. When we look at how the fees in these legislative proposals are being used, very little reinvestment in environmental projects. There's a significant investment in a couple bills on infrastructure, which is important. But the vast majority of these expense elements associated with the revenue generated from a carbon tax are based on subsidies, offsetting the potential negative economic impact on lower income consumers. It indicates to me that the authors of this understand the regressive nature of a carbon tax, and they're trying to mitigate the negative consequences. And that's important to keep in mind. The pursuit of reducing emissions may not be the primary objective of the expense profiles of these legislative initiatives. And I think, we don't advocate it all, but if we're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we need to use the fees collected from a carbon tax more effectively, because quite frankly, we've looked at the numbers. Price on gasoline does not necessarily affect consumption. I started off with a broad perspective when I wanted to evaluate this, and this is U.S. Energy Information Administration from 2010. The left side is a national average retail price of gasoline per month over the last 10 years. The x-axis is 1,000 barrels of gasoline consumed per day on a monthly average. So broad national numbers here. I'm not a statistician, so I always have to remind myself what a correlation coefficient means. When you run a statistical correlation between two variables, if they are perfectly linearly aligned, which means a movement in one will equate to a predictable movement in the other, the value is a 1 or a negative 1, 100% associated and negative 100% not associated. They are, or negatively associated. The last 10 years, it's been 0.7, negative 0.7, which means almost zero correlation between the two variables. Now, I showed this to the Board of Advisors of the Fuels Institute last week. We had about a 10-minute conversation as to what this means, what it could mean. And we recognize there's a lot of noise in that data. So I took another approach. The Fuels Institute right now is working on another project where we're evaluating the retail sale of ethanol blended products across the nation. We were able to collect daily sales data on volume, price, and margin from more than 2,000 retail stations between the dates of March 1, 2019 and February 29, 2020. I took all the unleaded price and volume data from those stores. Once I cleaned it up, it came out to 1,900 stores. And I ran the same correlation analysis to find out, is that same store relationship, does that affect demand? What I found is over that 12-month period, the coefficient was almost exact same as a 10-year national average before, which means there's almost no relationship between the gallons being sold on a daily basis at a convenience store, gas station, or nationally, relative to the price of that product. There are a lot of questions that can come from this. One is, what is the impact on a sudden increase of price on demand? But I've been studying gas prices and consumer behavior for the last 20 years. And what we have found, we surveyed consumers once a month for 5 years. Consumers would say that we'd ask them, what's the price of gasoline in your market? And they'll say it's $3 a gallon. At what price would you start changing your behavior? Combining trips, think about changing your vehicle, think about carpooling. It was always higher. And if that price they were paying today went up to $3.25, the price at which they would be inspired to change behavior also went up. If the price they were paying went down, the price at which they would change behavior went down. It is not the price they're paying at the pump. It's the delta between what they're paying now and what they think would cause them to change behavior. But what we've seen is, I started in the industry in 2000 when prices had not eclipsed $2 a gallon. Consumers become comfortable and used to the price they're paying, which makes me think that if you were to impose a carbon tax And if it resulted in an increase in gasoline prices of 40 cents a gallon, you might have an immediate reaction. You're going to have a lot of squealing, a lot of complaining, a lot of the sky is falling testimony from consumers and stakeholder groups. But most likely, the impact on gallons consumed would be temporary at best or non-existent at worst. So the impact of a carbon fee to reduce gasoline consumption may not be successful. How you use those revenues from a carbon fee to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through other mechanisms may be the best element of a carbon fee looking forward. And with that, David, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and see if there's any questions that we can address now, and then we'll come back and talk about biofuels in a minute. So any questions we should bring up and address now?
And those you use the chat function if anyone has any questions on this. So John, excellent presentation so far. The question I have when you look at this, and you're making the point on, as gasoline prices increase, it's a temporary impact. I do think, and based on kind of anecdotal evidence we've seen in earlier significant price increases, particularly when gasoline hit that $4 a gallon threshold, that in our experience, that indicated kind of a permanent change. So at 325, yeah, maybe temporary, 350 temporary, but when you're getting to $4 and above per gallon, then certain families, particularly those that are living in poverty or those that have a little less disposable income than others, are having to make some hard choices with their monthly budgets. Did y'all get to that level of specificity? Did you get that high in your price analysis at all?
We have not, but I'm going to be looking back at more historical data because I have a lot of that data already. And you are absolutely right. The higher the retail price of gasoline, the more regressive it is, and the more it hurts lower income families or larger families, those that can't afford that type of variability in their energy costs. And that's a huge consideration that needs to be thought through and figured out, which is why I think those carbon tax bills have so many subsidies for lower income families and individuals. When we hit $4 a gallon back in 2007, 2008 timeframe, before the big drop in oil prices, what we found is we did see a change in consumer behavior. We did see anecdotal evidence of people combining trips. They started going to one store to get everything they needed instead of 3 or 4. We started seeing some people explore more efficient vehicles. They're not changing their vehicles. This whole idea that when gasoline prices are low, people buy trucks. When gasoline prices are high, they buy sedans is absolutely fallacious. People buy the vehicle they need to buy, but they will, when prices are high, shop within a class of vehicle for a more efficient model. I mean, think about it. Every auto commercial you see, if they are proud of their fuel economy, they go best in class in fuel efficiency. You've never seen a advertisement say worst in class in vehicle fuel efficiency. Buy our vehicle and you will buy more gas than you've ever bought before. Consumers want fuel efficiency, and that price at the pump is an indicator of economic performance overall. However, when we hit $4 a gallon, there's something else that happened. The politicians started rattling their sabers about price gouging and trying to put pressure on the fuels industry to bring prices down because they were unsustainable for the economy. Now, the irony is some of those same politicians that would have railed against price gouging are the ones who are considering a carbon tax. And so there's an education element that needs to be done here in terms of speaking with the politicians who are looking to how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions and walking them through the pros and cons of their initiatives. Talk about the carbon, talk about the regressive nature, the impact on the market, talk about the potential lack of impact on GHG emissions if fuel demand isn't inelastic, as the data indicates it is, and help them identify ways to leverage the initiative they're thinking about to be more effective. Look, we all want to reduce emissions, but we can't do it by bankrupting families and businesses. We have to do it responsibly, and having an objective approach to these type of policy discussions is the best way to do it.
Great. Thanks, John. A couple questions coming in. Did you guys examine kind of phased in approach to a carbon tax at all over a number of years as folks kind of acclimate to it?
Right. We didn't really do that detailed analysis, but I think if you look at the elasticity charts I showed, that makes the best sense because consumer behavior, they become accustomed to what they're paying. And if you impose a 40 cent per gallon tax, boom, And I'm going to look at the history to see how that affects. I think rapid jolts to the price of gasoline affect the economy. They don't only affect consumer budgets, they affect consumer sentiment. We've asked customers for 5 years during the monthly surveys, how do you feel about the economy? To what extent does the price of gasoline affect your feelings about the economy? The price of gasoline was reported as 70 to 80% influencing their feelings about the economy. And so phasing in a 40 cent per gallon increase would be the right way to go, because then you mitigate that shock impact on the market and you get people comfortable with it before you raise it again. You let them adjust their budgets, and you don't give them this idea that the economy is just going crazy because of that posted price at the street sign.
Excellent. Well, why don't we continue? There's some questions I have that I think you address as you go forward in part 2 and part 3 of your presentation, and then we'll jump back in when you finish part 2.
Yep. Let me get this going again. All right. Can we see the slides now? So biofuel programs. We took a look at the low carbon fuel standard in California and the renewable fuel standard at the federal level. And I think it's really important that we pay attention to biofuels, because even if you are the most aggressive advocate for electrification, it is going to take decades before electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles represent half of the market, which means we're going to be consuming liquid fuels in internal combustion engines for a very, very long time. And we have to be thinking about, how do we reduce the carbon intensity of the product we're putting in these combustion engines? Think about the vehicle and the fuel as a system. Think about how we address emissions, life cycle emissions, from both fuels and vehicle, whether it's the electric vehicles and electrons or combustion engines and liquid fuels. I think biofuels have a great opportunity here. And I think they're going to be a major legislative issue, because the statutory volumetric provisions of the renewable fuel standard expire in 2022. And after that, it's up to EPA to set the standards going forward, with no legislative statutory targets to meet. And I think that's going to raise a concern about Congress to defer all that to EPA. And there's going to be discussions about, what do we do at the federal level on biofuels policy to create one that encourages lower carbon intensive products, supports the farmers, which was one of the core ingredients of the RFS way back when, but also results in a GHG reduction potential from the market. So I'm going to start off with the low carbon fuel standard out in California. It's the most mature one out there. And the main difference is, instead of setting volumetric targets, it sets a carbon intensity target. And the reason biofuels are so important, if you look here, this is from CARB, evaluating the carbon intensity of various products as it relates to California gasoline. Now, if you're familiar with the fuels market, California gasoline is the cleanest fuel in the country. They've had the ability to set their own standards for fuel quality and emissions profile. And so it is really the benchmark on the lowest carbon intense product out there. If you look where starch ethanol is, a lot of environmentalists don't like starch ethanol because it's not as clean as cellulosic ethanol or others. Even in 2020, it was 71 carbon intense compared to 99. The forecast from CARB is by 2040, it's going to be less than half the carbon intensity of straight gasoline. So that provides an opportunity. Renewable diesel, which is also, the way this is bucketed together, they label it renewable diesel. It's really biomass-based diesel. It's biodiesel and renewable diesel. We took a look at another chart. They have about the same carbon intensity score, but they're less than 1/3 carbon intense of California gasoline. You compare it to diesel, it's even lower. So you have opportunities here with both ethanol and biodiesel and renewable diesel to have an impact on the carbon profile of the liquid fuels we're putting through our combustion engines. Now, California has demonstrated, and this is California Energy Commission's forecast in 2018 when they last made adjustments to the program, for what fuels would generate credits in 2020. And we're in 2021 now, of course, but so this was done about 2 years ago. 77% of all the credits generated in 2020 to satisfy LCFS were expected to come from ethanol, biodiesel, and renewable diesel. The role and importance of biofuels cannot be overstated. It is a critical ingredient to reducing the carbon intensity of the fuel market. However, there are limitations. And we look at what California is doing. Their goal is to get to a 20% greenhouse gas carbon intensity reduction by 2030. And our researchers think they probably going to want to go up to 30% by 2030. But what happens is we need to start bringing in different products to get to this threshold. So far, we've only had to reduce the carbon intensity by 7.5%. by 25 is 13.75, 20% by 2030. In order to get there, we're going to have to see an increase in renewable diesel use. We're going to have to see an increase in electricity use. They're giving LCFS credits for electricity powering vehicles. We're going to have to see an increase in biomethane. We have to see an increase in new products. But that being said, as of now, we have a lot of room nationally to grow in using biofuels to reduce the carbon intensity of the fuel stock. At some point, we're going to have to introduce new tools, but we need to leverage and maximize the utility of the tools we have available to us now, and the LCFS gives us good indication. It's important to understand the LCFS because it's growing in intensity. Oregon mimics California. Washington State has tried to. The Midwestern governors have a consortium and a memorandum of understanding to explore a regional LCFS. I understand the New England states want to impose an LCFS as well. Congress is going to look at this as a federal possible option, and we need to understand the nuts and bolts. We published a report about 2 years ago from Trinity and Stillwater that really took a close look at how California has performed and the market reaction to the California LCFS. Very instructive for how LCFS at the national level might roll out and impact the market as we go forward. The impacts and the benefits and costs of the LCFS are very interesting as well. So the estimate is that by 2025, we will save about $8 billion in equivalent GHG emissions avoided. Fuel consumption due to fuel efficiency improvements, about $7 billion. The cost of compliance, however, is anywhere from $6 to $10 billion per year. So cumulative savings by 2025 is $15 billion, but the cost could be $10 billion annually. So the cost can outweigh the benefits depending on how the market is pursued and compliance is pursued. The results of the last study we did, which I'm talking about today, and the study we published a couple years ago are consistent. When we get to about 2025, the cost of the LCFS on a gallon basis is going to be about 70 cents a gallon. That's phased in over time, but 70 cents a gallon is more than a carbon tax that we were profiling earlier. 70 cents a gallon has an impact on consumers. And so weighing the benefits and costs is important to figure out, is the juice worth the squeeze, and is this the right policy to go forward with? But there's a lot of lessons to learn from the LCFS, and the carbon intensity profiles of the fuel products is very critical. The RFS, on the other hand, it was set up in 2005 and 2007, 36 billion gallons of qualified renewable fuels by 2022, set a volumetric target. You can see in the bar chart there, we have not met the volumetric target. Now, largely, that's because we're still relying on traditional biofuels. We have not had the breakthroughs in advanced biofuel production to make them economically viable on scale to have a major influence on the compliance profile for the RFS. So EPA has been having to waive volumetric requirements, particularly in the cellulosic ethanol area, because it's just not ready yet. And so you see the lack of compliance with what Congress had intended 13, 14 years ago. The impact is shown in that right chart there. Because the vast majority of compliance of RFS is traditional ethanol, and its life cycle greenhouse gas reduction potential is about 20%, the cumulative net impact of the RFS has been less than 5% reduction in GHG. That's not enough to get us where we need to be in terms of reducing the carbon emissions from the transportation sector. So there's a need to really evaluate the RFS, look at the LCFS for some lessons to see if we can come up with a new approach to biofuel policies to have a bigger impact on the market than what we're seeing here. On a cost basis, the benefit less than 5% GHG. Some compliance costs are estimating $5 to $20 billion a year in the cost to comply with the RFS, and that's predicated on what the cost of the renewable identification number credit is. Let's put that in perspective. It sounds like a lot of money. It really, in the big scheme of things, isn't that much. The convenience industry, which sells about 85% of the gasoline in the country every year, they generate, on average, depending on the price of gasoline, $400 billion in gas sales. So you're looking at $5 to $20 billion industry-wide, and in a market where the retail side is $400 billion. The refining side is several billion dollars as well. So percentage-wise, it may not be that huge of a cost, but that emissions reduction, that low level, is something we really need to be thinking about. How can we recraft our biofuel policies to provide incentives or to open up the pathway to bring lower carbon intense fuels to market faster, get them into the market, get them into the engines, and have a bigger impact? I think I'm part of an advisory group with EPA, and we're talking about how do we streamline the biofuel pathway approval process and fuel registration process to provide innovative solutions, an opportunity to benefit the market much more efficiently. And with that, David, I'll go and stop sharing, and we can see if there's any questions in the biofuel section.
And there we go. Feel free to jump in with any questions, and I'll pass those along to John. The one I had, John, in the LCFS and the RFS studies that you've done, and when you talk about is the juice worth the squeeze, and you're looking at the cumulative cost, there's also ancillary emission benefits that can be attributed to the RFS and the LCFS from a VOC, NOx, SOx, others. And CEA, as you know, has done a number of studies over the last 2 years showing overall emission reductions in the United States relative to other countries from a state-by-state perspective and a national perspective. And the U.S., as most people now know, is leading the world in emission reductions across the board,
right,
largely as we switch from coal to natural gas, and obviously more efficiencies and more conservation coming in. But when you look at the RFS and the LCFS and you look at, okay, these are emission mitigation strategies going forward, you focused here on carbon emissions and kind of a cost per ton of carbon emission reduction. But did y'all look at the ancillary benefits at all from a VOC, NOx, SOx, even PM perspective? I think that helps with the overall cost a little bit, maybe.
We did. We instructed the researchers at Ricardo Consulting to look at carbon, look at PM 2.5, and look at NOx because criteria pollutants are critical. They're important. If you think about what happened the past 9-10 months with the pandemic, coronavirus is a respiratory illness, a related illness, right? And the improvement we saw in air quality was not carbon, it was NOx. The reduction in travel improved air quality, and it's very important. It's so easy to get lost in the carbon discussion. I'm guilty of it for this presentation. I put together the carbon focus because that's what everybody's talking about. I think it's important to recognize and provide context to what people are talking about. But we need to look at emissions as a comprehensive suite of things that can harm us. Because quite frankly, tailpipe emissions of criteria pollutant nature can kill more people in the short term than carbon emissions will in the short term. Carbon emissions, that clearly there's long-term permanent issues we got to be paying attention to, but we also have to pay attention to our public health and environment now. And so you're right, biofuels have other benefits, and we did look at them. So there is, within the report, there is an assessment of what the PM 2.5 NOx emissions associated with the biofuels market has been as well. And it is generally positive. And we have to keep that in mind. And I thank you for pulling that out because I usually yell at everybody who doesn't talk about those and they only focus on carbon. And here I am being guilty of it as well. So thanks for holding my feet to the fire on that one.
Well, any chance I get to yell at you, it's always.
Yeah,
it's always.
I know.
And then the other question I had is when you look at this from a regional perspective, right? And so California has its LCFS, looking at other Western states. Some of the Midwestern states, as you mentioned, are looking at their own LCFS. The New England states, not only LCFS, but TCI and some other things that they're looking at. The breakdown that you see from a regional perspective, when you look at California gasoline and diesel prices relative to some of their neighbor states or the rest of the country, when you're looking at the New England states increasing their gasoline prices as they implement these new policies compared to some of the southern or southeast states, how do we as a nation grapple with these vast price discrepancies as different states take on different approaches to meeting some of these emission reduction goals?
Well, I think quite frankly, it requires a national approach. I think the balkanization of fuel regulations has been going on since the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990s. That started when people tried to get out of using MTBE and they didn't want to be part of the formula gasoline program. But it's accelerated. I think when President Trump announced early on in his term that he was going to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement, a lot of states and localities go, wait a second, we want to continue contributing to GHG emission reductions. We're going to pursue our own policies. We're going to pursue our own strategies to reduce carbon emissions. And that basically decentralized an approach. And it creates haves, have-nots, winners and losers, economic disparities that are more pronounced under those scenarios than otherwise would be. And keep in mind, we have economic differences in all these regions. There's reasons why fuel prices are different in the South than they are in the Midwest and the West Coast. There are fundamental logistical differences in how the system is structured and how it operates. But when you layer on these regional or local approaches to emissions control, it really confuses the market, makes it very challenging to evaluate the benefits and costs of these. I really think, if we can have a national discussion about what is the US approach, what is a North American approach, what is a global approach to reducing emissions, and look at transportation from a proportional perspective. Because here's the problem. I think so often regulators and advocates look at transportation because that's what people can touch, feel, they understand. Everybody's ridden in a vehicle. They all understand the emissions that are associated with transportation. They don't necessarily understand the electricity generation. They don't necessarily understand all these other things. But the politicians can say, we need to reduce it from transportation because you understand that. But transportation is being asked to carry a burden greater than its proportional emissions. And we need to try to keep that in perspective and try to create a holistic approach that addresses emissions from the sources, including natural sources like wildfires. How do we prevent wildfires that contribute so much to the air quality problems and carbon releases of the world? How do we create a comprehensive approach that balances our emissions reductions and carbon mitigation strategies with the cost to the consumer? And that's the only way we're going to be successful going forward.
Great. All right, John, thank you very much. Let's jump to part 3 of your presentation, and then we'll come back for more Q&A in a minute.
Yeah, we're running a little short on time, so I will speed up if that's possible. Sorry. Vehicle electrification. And I tied into this some ICE bans too. We broke this into 3 categories: charging infrastructure, subsidies, incentives, and ZEV mandate. Highest effectiveness of everything we looked at, almost the highest cost of everything we looked at. Electrification is not a low-cost strategy. It is a part of a solution. I don't think it is the solution, but it is part of the solution. Let's deconstruct some of these as we go. First of all, why are people paying attention and so focused on ZEVs and electrification? There's a lot of debate out there. Are they cleaner? What's the life cycle impact? The CEO of Polestar, an EV company, said we have to stop saying EVs are clean. They have the potential to be cleaner. We have a lot of work to do. That being said, most studies are showing that on a life cycle GHG emissions on a broad regional basis, that they are at least slightly better on GHG emissions than internal combustion engines. Now, you can pick out regions that are not because they rely on antiquated generation capacity, or they don't have, they have higher efficiency vehicles. But overall, you see an advantage to EVs on GHG on a life cycle basis. And as the grid gets cleaner, that's going to grow. That advantage is going to grow. There are trade-offs here, and the Fuels End wants to look at a cradle to grave analysis, not just life cycle, but cradle to grave, to really better understand those dynamics. But right now, most of the literature out there is saying that there is an advantage to it. It is not a race. People are saying it's a revolution. Revolutions are quick, sudden changes. I don't see that. This year is the first time plug-in vehicles eclipsed 2% share of all light-duty vehicles sold, and that's largely because the entire auto industry got hammered at the beginning of the pandemic shutdowns. That being said, I think there's great opportunity for it to grow in market share going forward. And here's one of the main reasons. To date, most of your EVs are passenger cars or sedans. They're cars, they're mid-sized cars or luxury cars, $100,000 cars. By the end of this decade, more than 75% of the electric vehicles produced in the United States will be light trucks or utility vehicles. I just ran the analysis for 2020. Light trucks and utility vehicles represent more than 70% of all vehicles sold in the United States. So in the next 5-6 years, EVs are going to be introduced that satisfy the needs profile of the consumer, the desirable profile of the consumer. If you have a family of 5, you aren't likely going to buy an EV right now because they're not big enough, and the ones that are big enough are too expensive. So we have to figure that's going to change rapidly. But even if we get to a point where Bloomberg New Energy Finance is right, let's say they project 60% of sales by 2040 will be electric. If they're right, and I doubt they will be unless there's government mandates, that's only going to equate to 27% of vehicles on the road because the market's huge. People hold on to their vehicles a long time. It takes a long time to turn this market over. So even with a rapid expansion in sales, the impact on the market is going to be much more modest. That is why we have people looking at increasing zero-emission vehicle bans, banning the sale of internal combustion engines, because they recognize left to its own devices, the market moves slowly. And if they're not patient and they don't want to wait for that change to happen, they're going to try to accelerate it. But this is exactly why the previous conversation on biofuels is so important. As we slowly transition to zero emission vehicles, we need to do something about the combustion engines that are going to stay on the market for decades to come. Now, subsidies and incentives is a huge impact. Right now, the average BEV costs about $8,000 to $12,000 more than a comparable internal combustion engine. So we have a $7,500 tax credit at the federal level. We have state tax credits. We have other incentives, access to HOV lanes, driving by yourself, parking incentives, rebates, no emissions testing, a whole bunch of different incentives layered in almost every state of the country to try to incentivize consumers to move into EVs. These are not going to be as critical in the next couple of years because most people believe battery electric vehicles will be offered on par, price parity, competitive on paper with the combustion engine. And when you take consider the life cycle total cost of ownership, they are already cheaper to own and operate than an internal combustion engine. But that purchase price is a disincentive and a detractor from its marketability. That's going to change in the near future, and here's why. Battery costs have already come down. They're down to $137 in 2020 from almost $600 in 2014. The target, the break even, is under 100. And I'm seeing a lot of reports that $70 kilowatt hour batteries are on the horizon. So we're going to have a viable economic option in electric vehicles very soon. Does that mean consumers are going to buy the vehicle? Not necessarily. That's why you're having these discussions about bans on combustion engines. ZEV mandates, basically ICE bans, ZEV bans, same thing, just a different cover. We've got states there that have ZEV mandates. It is an effective initiative to convert to ZEVs because you're forcing the market, but it's expensive. You're looking at studies here showing that a cost of a ZEV mandate can be anywhere from $8.5 to $10.2 billion over the study period through 2025. The impact on fuel economy, however, could be high. So you're looking at $600 on the high side cost per vehicle in extra cost to the consumer over the course of ownership, but possibly savings of up to $15,000 in fuel. Problem is consumers don't always do a total cost of ownership calculation when they're buying a car. They're buying a vehicle based on what they want, what they like, what they need, and what the purchase price is. They're very uncertain about the benefit on energy consumption because the price is so volatile. So ZEV mandates are definitely cause celeb today for a lot of stakeholders. Infrastructure is key too. Some of these are some old studies, but I like that middle one. It's 2011, 2013. I think the numbers changed, but it's a 10% increase in the number of charging stations would increase EV sales by 8%. That's not necessarily true today, but every study we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years, infrastructure, availability of chargers, range anxiety, they're all limiting people's appetite for electric vehicles. So we need to build the infrastructure. And right now, we have not built the infrastructure the way the customer wants. The circle chart on the left shows you the facilities listed in DOE's alternative fuel database that have chargers. Now, not all the chargers out there are affiliated with a facility in the database, but a third of them are. And you see 29% of charger at hotels, in lodging establishments, 14% of car dealerships, 10% shopping centers. Well, we're going to be publishing a report here in the next couple of months. Consumers in 2019, they want chargers at grocery stores. Well, only 2% of chargers are located at grocery stores. They want chargers at restaurants. Only 3% of chargers in the market today are at restaurants. We need to do a better job of deploying chargers in the locations people want them and with the capabilities appropriate for those use cases. We do not need DC fast chargers everywhere, but we need more DC fast chargers at high commute, long route areas than we need level 2 chargers. And there's middle grounds. There's a lower power DC fast chargers that can fit a lot of use cases. So we're going to be building profiles on which chargers, what capabilities make the most sense at what type of facilities, and how do we marry up the consumer demand with their needs. ICE bans, we didn't cover that much in our report, but I've done a little analysis recently because of the rash of the increase in announcements recently. California executive order in November, ban ICE sales by 2035. British Columbia a year before said 2040, so Quebec said we can do better than that. We're going to do 2035. The one I think is hilarious, and I'm going to be a little tongue-in-cheek here, but several years ago, the UK said we're going to ban combustion engine sales by 2040. In February of last year, Boris Johnson said we're going to do it in 2035. Then you have California, Quebec move. Johnson came out in November and said, no, I meant 2030. So there seems to be one-upsmanship going on here in terms of getting credit for leading the charge on combustion engine ban sales, which it leads me to kind of dismiss them a little bit until I look at the circle chart. 47% of the vehicles sold in the world are sold into a market that is considering or has actively pursued and begun the process of banning the sale of combustion engines. If you add to that California, Japan, which is going to do it here pretty soon, that number is going to eclipse 50% of the global market. So not something going away. Ties in directly to the zero emission vehicle. Legislators, regulators are not going to be patient and waiting for the market to turn of its own volition. They want to force it. They want to make it happen faster because they believe this is the solution to carbon emissions. Quite frankly, it is part of the solution. But as I pointed out with biofuels and carbon fees, there needs to be a comprehensive approach. There's no silver bullet, no one size fits all solution that's going to make this work. And with that, I'll leave you with this chart here, and then we can open up for more questions before I get cut off here. The report has a 40, 50-page report, an index of 170 slides with a guide to reading those slides. I suggest you take a look at it. We're going to continue diving deep into this throughout the year. We're going to focus on electrification. We're going to focus on biofuels. We're going to focus on a few other policies that are being addressed in here and building them out more so we have a better understanding. We also know that there's a relationship between a lot of these. And I talked about a comprehensive approach. It might be a kitchen sink of different things, but if they're put together in a way that works, that could be very effective. We're going to endeavor to try to link some of those and try to understand better how they affect one another. For example, how does a carbon fee affect the biofuels market? How does a ZEV mandate affect decarbonization of other sectors? We want to understand the interaction between them because it's so important. So much is at stake here in terms of being effective and being cost conscious to our consumers that we really need to focus on that. And this report is really our first foray into that and helping people get a feel for where we are on that. And that's the last slide I have. So I'll open it up to any questions anybody might have, David.
John, fantastic presentation. There's a lot there. For all the CEA members on the call, we will include a link to the presentation and to the report that John just mentioned in the weekly bulletin that will be coming out later today or first thing tomorrow. So that's a real good, convenient way for you guys to get that. John, I mean, next steps, you and I have talked about a little bit on reaching out to policymakers around the country, just to help inform decisions as they go forward to make sure that we're meeting energy needs that are affordable, reliable, and continuing good environmental stewardship. What is the Fuel Institute planning here and next steps to really disseminate this study and all the good works? I know you've been speaking a lot, but what else are you guys planning to help get this study around?
Well, because I can't fly right now, I'm a lot more efficient with my use of time. So we've reached out to all the associations that are affiliated with the Fuels Institute. We've offered to do a presentation like this, customized for each one of them for their staff and their elected leaders to help them better understand it. We have a strategy where we're reaching out to key committees of jurisdiction in the United States Congress, administration offices once they get settled after the inauguration, caucuses of interested legislators up in Washington. We're going to work with CEA to reach out to key stakeholders at the state level to help them understand the resources here. So that's what we're doing independently. But I think, everybody in CEA and the fuels and anybody out there, all of the research we do, all the publications we put out there are free. They're open to everybody. Take a look at them, use them. If you find something in our report that you think is helpful for you to educate your stakeholders and the people you're trying to educate on the dynamics of different policies, use our report. Pull anything out of it you want. Give me a call. If you need help finding elements of the report that help support what you're trying to educate, we do not advocate. I want to make that perfectly clear. We don't advocate. We really don't have a preference of what happens. We just want people to have better information when they make their decisions. Let us help you identify the information that can help you educate your stakeholders. So I think, we got a lot of good information here, probably more than anybody can digest themselves. I've spent hours upon hours reviewing the slides to try to understand it more. And every time I look at them, I see new stuff. But if we can all use similar information, objective, fact-based analyses to help our elected leaders better understand their options, then I think we're further along the line of having responsible government, which is so critical as we start trying to figure out how we dig ourselves out of the emissions hole we're in while still ensuring that we continue to deliver to American consumers the most affordable energy in the world. That's something we have to be laser focused on, is it's not an either or. It can be both,
Right.
but it might take a little more work than some are willing to put into it.
Agreed. Well, listen, John, thank you very much on behalf of the entire CEA team and all the CEA membership. We had a lot of folks on this call, so obviously a lot of interest in the subject, and you did a fantastic job. So really appreciate your time.
Okay,
And
thank you.
we'll be back in touch with everyone on our next Tele-Townhall in the next couple weeks. But again, John Eichberger, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.